So does anybody, is this working? Yeah. So does any of you have any comments so far on what I've said?
Hi. Okay. So the MRC is a relatively simple organization. We only do two things. We set standards and conduct audits against them. So for this particular problem, of course, what we're doing is working on setting standards. And when we set standards, it's often a very big, onerous project. It's open. There's hundreds of companies that participate, and we try to seek consensus. And to Ivor's point, what we tried to recognize when we're setting these standards is that while in the US there's competitive products for measurement, but there is disparate measurement, also internationally you have JICs and MOCs that stipulate measurement currencies, and they're different. So when we set standards, it's less prescriptive in terms of the methodology and more of a framework of quality research and data that a multitude of methodologies can be applied against. And we've reached the end of a pretty long journey, or we're getting to the end of a pretty long journey, in that we release standards for public comment about cross-screen measurement in March for a 60-day public comment period. That ends in a couple of weeks, and we think we've gotten a lot of consensus. There's still controversial aspects and debates, but I think we're to the point where we don't want to sacrifice progress for pursuit of perfection and get something out there so we can begin to evaluate these products and bring consistency. And the last thing I'll say is that we've done a lot of work to get digital here, right? We've done a lot of work in setting standards to get digital on a level playing field with traditional media, invalid traffic, viewability, et cetera. A lot of what the standard does is turn attention over to traditional media to say, well, can we get more ad-focused, impression-focused, granular? Because having a level currency and granularity and expectation is really how you get to true cross-media measurement, is having that apples-to-apples comparison.
In France, Mediametrie is of course working a lot on these issues. We see two pillars and two big things to be addressed. First of all, there's of course all the measurement platforms and the techniques to collect the data. How can we build an infrastructure that will publish as TV was published every day, every morning, and build something that will release every day TV measurement and video measurement with all the screens and all the new usage. We are about to release in France a new platform, a new system that will use a new technology, individual metering system that 3,000 panel members will carry every day, in addition to the traditional TV measurement, to have an out-of-home and mobility measurement. And we found out in France that this out-of-home usage was much higher than we anticipated. And the second pillar to our thinking is how can we connect the ecosystem, the TV ecosystem with the online ecosystem. And for that, there are many aspects. We mentioned the metrics and the norms and the lots of work that has been done in that field. But there's more to that, because the TV data stands in a media planning systems. And those media planning systems today, they're not used anymore in the online world. So how can we connect those tools and those systems with the ad serving environment? And we have quite a few projects in France by using similar metrics, pulling metrics from the ad serving environment and putting them in the TV world. And also we're trying to find ways to put our media planning TV data in pre-bid ad serving environment. And all that represent lots of challenges, and to help us address all these challenges, we've formed an alliance, the Global Alliance for the Measurement of Media Audiences, with the Indian BARC, with the Canadian Numeris, and with the Japanese Video Research. And we hope that this association will help us share experiences and build stronger measurement in the future. Thank you.
I'd like to say that we agree. That's all. Just kidding. Just kidding. No. So it's very important to us that we work with our advertisers and agency partners to give a holistic view of all the impressions that we deliver across a multitude of platforms. We've got linear television, OTT, connected TV, full episode players, and in addition, one of the things that we don't talk about that much on linear television, as mentioned, is out of home, and that's something that we have seen to actually be a very meaningful audience and across a multitude of genres. Again, I'll echo the sentiment that it was a surprise to us to see how big these out-of-home audiences really were. And as I mentioned, working very closely with our agency partners, what we feel like we've done, we put together a framework that, for the most part, I would say is very much in line with the MRC guidelines, where we are, able to deliver one set of numbers that are representing all of these different platforms.
Thank you. It seems to me if there is to be movement ahead in the kind of area that we're talking about, that there may be a number of steps involved. Even some very basic steps. I have to say, when I first came to my first ICOM conference, which was in 2011, not that long ago, but a long time ago, I sat where you're sitting now, and frankly, I barely understood what people were talking about. Because back then, on the non-TV side, people were using their own jargon, and almost, it seemed to me, desperately trying not to use TV words like ratings and cover and reach and targeting, because those were TV words, and the one thing they didn't want to be was associated with what was then seen, not true, as a dying medium. But it does raise questions in my own mind about, even within the single geography, let alone wider than that, do we all use the same terminology? And when we do we mean the same things? Or are there times when we use the same words and mean different things, or different words and mean same things? So it's almost a matter of whether we need to start using the same terms before you can even talk about, well, we're measuring the same things in the same ways. I don't know whether there's a point anybody wants to make about that.
Just that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Julien, you go first. No, go ahead.
Oh, I totally agree, and still today we see there are 10 ways to name something differently in the US, in Germany maybe, or in France. But I believe one of the big issues in this world is that there are actually two different worlds colliding. The TV world is a media world where an advertiser has a message, a three-dimensional message, X, Y for the video, and time, the third dimension. And in this world, the advertiser is on a message. He wants to say something, and measuring what has been said is essential. And that another world coming from the digital space is the world of efficiency. We don't really care about what you said. We just want to know if it converts. And I think the collusion and those two worlds meet today, and this TV plus online reunion stands a lot of problem because sometimes we have difficulties setting the border between those two worlds, and for sure they are mixed most of the time, but I think it is one of the reasons why we have so much difficulties putting those two together.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. That was very well said, and it is a collision of the two separate worlds. It's also, to Ivor's point, a collision of terms of art that have been used in traditional media for some time, and words, the same terms that have been used in proprietary manners and currency and things like that. And even when it's the same term and even the same spiritual definition, like a GRP. Everybody knows what a GRP is, reach and frequency, but there are differing, inputs, qualifying moments, et cetera, that are used. Even impression. I mean, impression has been used for a long time in digital, but even before that for advertising, and an impression in TV versus an impression in digital aren't the same thing. And I think it's just important that when we're standardizing, we recognize that, we try to be clear, we try to be consistent. We also don't try to reinvent the wheel and invent terms that if they're existing taxonomies and lexicons that we're using that, but you're right, it is difficult.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that is, I applaud the work of groups like the MRC, and I really feel strongly that these groups should exist because I don't want to have to negotiate with my clients about things like definitions. There are so many other things that we should be focusing on. So I absolutely believe that having consistency in terminology just makes our whole business move forward.
Thank you. Linking on from that, it seems to me, and picking up a point that Ron's just made, you know, even within the single geography, even within one part of the audiovisual arena, is there full understanding of how the measurements take place? I'm reminded, you know, some people in the room may know that the UK's TV JIC, Barb, produces a syndicated, effectively, measurement alongside the TV audience measurement for the broadcasters of their online viewings, their streams, basically. And that grew out of work that I was originally involved in years and years ago, where we started to talk about comparing our measurements. I worked for ITV, the biggest of the commercial TV channels. How did we measure our streams compared to how the BBC did it, or Channel 4, or 5, or Sky? And what we found back then was, even though we were all doing the same thing, we weren't necessarily doing it the same way, and we may or may not have been using the same words to mean different things, which is why even then the idea of doing this kind of thing jointly makes sense. So, for instance, and I appreciate that the MRC has been involved, as I think was said on this stage yesterday, in work to audit, for instance, I know mentioning them again, Facebook and Google, but even when they use words, do they mean the same thing, bearing in mind they're each doing their measurements separately?
That sounded like it was for me. So we aim that that's the case. So one thing that we do is we're setting standards with other organizations, with the IAB, that we've set the digital standards in, and to Sunil's point, to try to take out the variability in definitions, like things like impressions and viewable impressions, et cetera. That doesn't mean that when we come and audit someone that they're not using terminology that's inconsistent, and we try to make sure that that's the case. So in the US with competitive products, it becomes a little bit difficult, and what we can't control is people that don't submit themselves to the audit and they're misusing those things, and they create that chaos. But for those that are audited, our goal very much is, well, if an impression is defined, or a video impression is defined, or a viewable impression is defined, that if you are using that term, you're defining it in the same way, and maybe not necessarily measuring it in the same way. There might be different methodologies, but we use that consistent framework to say that the end result is consistent. You have some of that internationally too, with JICs and MOCs that are very specific, that do audits to confirm that. Outside of that, it gets a little grayer.
I would like to add to that that the structure of the market and the way that markets are organized sometimes stands a problem. In France, Mediametrie was lucky we were born with TV and radio, but 20 years ago we started to measure online, and we are the reference measurement for online. So when we have those discussions between TV and online, all the teams are in the same building, and now all the teams report to the same person. I run the TV and the online business. So from a cultural standpoint, we do all that we can to make sure that these culture mix. And when you go to other countries, in some countries there's a JIC for TV, there's a JIC for online. Sometimes those two JIC talk, sometimes not at all. Sometimes they produce metrics and reportings that may be confusing to the market. So I think that the way the market is organized and the way the market commission the measurement to bodies like us is a critical aspect of that issue too.
Again, I would just like to say I'm glad that he's here. That's all.
I mean, one of the points, I think, picking up something that Julien just said, is certainly it's true, I think, on this continent, even within the TV JIC world, that everybody says, I'm doing the same thing that you're doing in your country, but actually, when you look into some of the details, some of the ways things are defined, even though the measurement is the same, obviously how you use the data may not be, you may often find that it's not exactly the same. You know, for instance, how reach is calculated, or what do you mean by the individual demographics? And it can certainly be very difficult, frankly, to get hold of a reference manual, the real detail that you need if you're not already a subscriber. Just moving on, it may well be, maybe it's an ideal, maybe it's not, that one day there will be a single measurement. It won't be a single source measurement, but it'll be a single measurement for all of audiovisual. That, of course, raises all sorts of questions about what market do each party think they're in. And I have to say, back, and pending things Julien may say, but bearing in mind the hybrid that I mentioned earlier on, and again, I can only speak from my UK barb experience, that we started to talk about the hybrid when I sat on the bar board in 2007, and it's still work in progress, which is no one's fault. It turned out to be a much more complicated thing than everyone ever thought it was going to be. And then once people got the system to meet the environment had changed. But putting that for a moment on one side, we are where we are, and advertisers are still asking those same questions. How many people saw my ad? Who were they? How often? And what it seems to me quite a number of people are now working on, probably for some while, is, well, whilst we're waiting for the ideal to come, we'll produce something. We'll bring together data sets and we'll try and answer those questions in our own ways. I mean, a number of people in this room will probably be aware of NBC Sea Flight, which is being brought over to Europe as well. And so it raises the question in my mind, first of all, is that these things should happen, is that a good idea? And if it is a good idea, is there a danger that we end up moving away from one currency or even two currencies to a whole range of individual proprietary currencies with all those issues about, are you doing it the same way? Do you mean the same things? Can we make comparisons? I don't know if anybody wants to make a comment on that.
Well, I mean, to start, I think you said it best, that the ideal is some, global, consistent, ubiquitous, always-on measurement. But I think it's an ideal at this point. The reality is that there's disparate measurement, and the best case scenario is you're using a vendor that can measure multiple mediums. Maybe they've got a television measurement product and a digital measurement product, but it's very likely that they're not even using the same methodology for those. They've got different assets, et cetera. The other side of the coin is you're probably using disparate vendors with different methodologies for the different mediums, and the reality is that is the existent measurement, and you have to figure out how to baseline that, combine it on a consistent basis. And the one thing that I just wanted to put out there, and maybe this shifts the discussion, and I apologize if it does, but we've talked a lot about technical things, right? And a lot of the debates around the standards around those, what's the right time in pixels and seconds, et cetera, and those are eminently knowable and measurable. The difficult piece with all this is taking those disparate data sets and deduplicating identity resolution among those exposures. And that is something that I don't think there are a ton of very robust solutions out there. There are some that are in process. And I think beyond the technical measurement and combining those data sets, we need to get to the session deduplication and identification and how to do that, especially in a GDPR privacy world, I think is the difficult thing.
I love that, and just want to jump on the bandwagon and say, one of the conversations that we have internally a lot is just about how little knowledge and understanding there are about identity graphs and the role of identity graphs. And frankly, we think that's one of the areas that really needs to be focused on in the coming years, particularly as media continues to shift to be multi-platform, so on and so forth.
Well, I think that is one of the reasons why panels and strong panel will continue to be strong. We hope that in France, the technology I showed you has the potential to be a single source approach for all the contact with the TV usage. So we hope that this will be a strong way to answer to that question. And back to your first question, Ivor, I believe that there is still this question of what are the objectives of the advertiser ultimately. And if the advertisers has some direct marketing objective, then his way of measuring a campaign may be different than if he has more traditional media approaches. And I guess that I hope that for media approaches we'll be able to merge toward a single currency. But I believe that because there are other objectives than advertisers pursue, I think that there will be other metrics. But it should be clear what objective and in what part of the market we are in.
Absolutely. If all of our clients wanted to buy all of our platforms, I guarantee you we would be a lot farther along with this.
I'm pleased to say we've got some questions from the audience, so I don't have to use mine. So the first one is an interesting one, maybe more relevant, if I may say, to the United States than to Europe. Don't TV networks have to measure individual spots to be comparable to digital video measurement? Is that on the roadmap for networks?
I guess that's me. It is something that we are exploring. We are absolutely aware of the fact that in traditional linear television measurement, we are looking at average minute audiences versus an exact impression on the digital side. So we are exploring this. No decisions have been made. But particularly as we think about the future where more of our viewership will absolutely be streamed and not linear, we feel that this is something that we need to look into.
And I'll agree completely this time with Sunil. Right back at you. And that is on the roadmap. That actually is in the standards. So that was also another one of those controversies, because I mentioned earlier that we've done a lot with digital. We've given digital a lot of tough medicine. You've got to be filtered for IVT and viewable and have audience and brand safe and all those other things, and we've kind of left the traditional currencies alone. And now it's time to focus back on that and say, is there really any reason why we don't have ad-focused impression, second-level measurement? And what we've said is it very much depends on how the ads are delivered and monetized, because something like an average minute audience or a time-based proxy for ad delivery makes sense when everyone viewing the content at the same time sees the same thing. But when you have dynamic ad insertion, that completely breaks down. What does an average minute on YouTube mean? It means nothing. So measuring the actual ad and the impression is very much the focus, particularly where there's dynamic ads and content, at least in the standards we're putting out.
Another question, are standard demographics and GRPs as important in the world of broadcaster and advertiser first-part data?
Sorry, I missed the first part of that.
Sorry, are standard demographics and GRPs as important in the world of broadcaster and advertiser first-part data? Do you want to pick that one up?
Yes. I'm not really sure how to answer that question. Absolutely, demographics and GRPs are very important.
Another one. With the proliferation of smart TVs, and you may have a view on that as well, how long do the panel members think it will be that TV measurement will sync with digital measurement?
Those connected TVs offer possibilities to collect data. There's nothing new here. In France, 60% of the population receives TV through IPTV. So there are already huge data sets in this environment, but there are many, at least in Europe, there are some legal issues, GDPR, you've heard about it. There are some individualization problem because a set-top box data set is not an individual data set. And we invest huge sum of money in our panels to make sure that there's someone in front of the TV set. A set-top box data doesn't have that data, but we all acknowledge that there is a usage for that very granular data. And we've believed for a long time in France, and I know that many other countries are aligned with that hybrid measurement, mixing panel and big data, is probably opening the doors for the future. And if we want to measure addressable TV without those huge data sets, it will be very difficult to answer that question.
I agree. I'll push back on one thing, though. When it comes to the question of do we know whether or not people are in the room, that is built into the Nielsen panel measurement. And so we do have a sense of that, and that is an element of our existing ratings. But at the same time, I will say I'm personally very excited about the possibilities that come with combining smart TV data with traditional set-top boxes. Already, outside of audience measurement, I can tell you we're already seeing a lot of advances on the attribution side from this.
Right, and just building on that there's definitely usage. Anytime you can get more granular, robust data, there's use for it if you use it in the right way. ACR, whether it's audio or video ACR that's out there is very good, very granular. It's also requires reference sites. It has some limitations at the local level because those are national. And to Julian's point, there's this question of privacy and opt-in and who has the rights and so on and so forth. But I think it's not something that's necessarily going to be a scalable, ubiquitous solution, but it is something that existing measurement systems can use and ingest to improve the assumptions they make, the models, et cetera, to just give them a more granular view of the data.
We're virtually out of time, so there won't be time to answer the questions on the stage, but I will read out the last two, and maybe whoever asks them, they're both anonymous, can catch whoever they want on here to ask them. So here we go, time's up, it tells me. Curious if anyone is thinking about the potential impact of 5G. And the other one is, why do TV vendors still sell broad demographic groups when advertisers want to buy behaviorally defined consumers? There isn't time, I'm afraid. Sorry, Julie. Very interesting question. Well, you can find...
Yes, and I don't know.
You can try and find one of the chaps here. There you go. So once again, I want to thank Ron, Sunil, Julien, and I hope you found this an interesting session. And my next step, for those who were with me last year, is to get off the stage without falling down.